aside 10 minutes for you. The time is yours, and if you'd like to leave time for questions within that time frame, so entirely up to you. So you're very welcome.
Thanks. I want you to consider for a moment what would happen if diesel fuel supplies ran out across New Zealand tonight. Meals at Bellamy's or any of your other favourite restaurants would be off the menu. Supermarket shelves would be empty by Monday. Tractors, harvesters and trucks carrying farm products to processors and to export hubs would stop. Every day, 5.8 million litres of milk would flood farmland and rivers. Thousands of tonnes of food would go to waste. Our fishing fleets would stay in port, inter-island ferries would not run. Railway tracks would be silent and truck fleets would stay in their yards. Thousands of tonnes of cargo stacked at ports and in warehouses would go nowhere. The heavy machinery of construction, infrastructure, road building and forestry would all come to a halt. This list is only the tip of a vastly complex iceberg from which job losses, commercial losses and bankruptcies would follow. Food shortages could see New Zealanders facing the kind of starvation we've only ever seen on television. This is not a fanciful risk. We are heavily dependent on a regular fuel supply, yet the government is relying on oil company promises that they will be able to import and supply adequate amounts of refined fuel into the indefinite future so that we will never have to face the grim circumstances I just outlined. But ask yourself, what could go wrong? How can Channel Infrastructure make that guarantee? What penalty could possibly help us if they failed? Channel Infrastructure can make dozens of promises, but it is the people of New Zealand who stand to lose a great deal if their commitments turn out to be hollow words. To put it differently, we need some form of insurance against circumstances that prevent overseas shipments of fuel reaching us. Penalties and promises are not insurance. Our only real insurance is what we provide for ourselves. Are there plans to deal with disruptions to our fuel supply? Are there alternatives to the Asian refineries from which our fuel is now imported? If these plans exist, the 18,000 New Zealanders who signed the Save the Refinery petition would certainly like to see them. What are the sanctions that will be imposed on Channel Infrastructure if they can't keep their promises? And whatever the sanctions, what plan B does the government have for action if their assurances collapse? In the real world, every commercial risk is covered by some form of insurance to protect against loss of income. Is New Zealand really comfortable with an uninsured risk to our economy? Our Australian counterparts have anticipated the possibility of significant disruption and planned for it by keeping refineries operational. Yet the New Zealand government is not willing to insure the New Zealand economy against the very real risk of supply chain failure for our fuel. The paper written by MB and presented to Cabinet in November 21 by Energy Minister Megan Woods states, there does not appear to be a clear case for maintaining refinery operations for fuel resilience reasons, except to address an exceptional no fuel inputs scenario. This is an unlikely scenario, but not entirely implausible. Therefore, I believe the option of maintaining refinery capacity warrants an active decision by government. The active decision by this government was to do nothing. Crucially missing from the report was the analysis of what those scenarios might be and the potential cost to the country if one eventuated. New Zealand researcher Tobias Daly investigated 15 years of oil security risk assessments done for the government. He says, when I started my research, I was quite baffled to find assumptions that the market could weather any crisis and that we haven't actually conducted a comprehensive assessment or modelling of our supply chain and its security. So let's just take a moment to consider the exceptional no fuels input scenarios MB is willing to gloss over. Number one, Russia's annexation of Crimea and the potential for further Russian occupations as the ties of former Russian allied states to NATO strengthened. Number two, China's increasing economic power, more aggressive attitude to Taiwan, and increasing spread of influence into the Pacific. While others have noticed these events and found them concerning, MB, it appears, has not. These improbable scenarios have now come to pass. Russia has invaded Ukraine, causing massive spikes in fuel prices. From the Financial Times last week, oil prices have renewed their rise in the most sustained descent since Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a fuel supply crunch adds pressure to the market. And further, the disturbance to flows of oil and related products from Russia has rippled through energy markets as refineries are racing to pump out petroleum products to meet the needs of a global economy that is still emerging from the shock of COVID-19. China has now signed a security agreement with the Solomon Islands and is touring other Pacific nations, seeking agreements on security and development. Apparently, we did not see this coming. MB did not see it coming, but others did. The new AUKUS pact between Australia, Britain, and the US, announced late last year, was in response to Chinese expansion. It will see Australia cruising nuclear-powered submarines as tensions rise across the Pacific. Those tensions have the potential to put pressure on shipping routes from the Asian refineries, which are currently our only source of fuel. If those shipping lanes are closed, where will New Zealand's refined fuel come from? How long will it take to source alternatives in a world already facing a fuel supply crunch? And here's a third possibility. From Reuters, 9th January 2020, Asian refiners prefer to process Middle East crude grades as they are generally cheaper than oil from other regions due to relatively higher sulfur levels. Despite efforts to source crude from beyond the Middle East, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan still need to import 75% of their crude from the Gulf. And this from the Financial Times. Oil markets also face fresh threats to supply after Iran seized 2 Greek tankers last week, dimming the possibility of any breakthrough in the Iranian nuclear deal, which would pave the way for a return of the country's oil supplies to global supply chains. The move may additionally curb the free flow of oil out of the Middle East by other producers. We have just identified 3 potentially high consequence events. Are we going to leave our heads in the sand and ignore what's going on around us? We stand exposed, at risk, with no insurance. So what should we do? Provide that insurance policy by having a working refinery. We produce in Taranaki approximately 1/3 of the maximum throughput capacity of the refinery. While not designed to run on that grade of crude, it could do so in a crisis. The refinery infrastructure is now redundant, programmed for demolition. Its value to channel infrastructure is in the scrap steel range only. It is cheaper now to acquire than ever before. As our petition recommends, the government could declare the Marsden Point Oil Refinery a nationally strategic asset and compulsorily purchase it from channel infrastructure, turning it back into a state-owned enterprise. The Reserve Bank has already created around $60 billion in the last 2 years, and the estimated 100 to 150 million needed to purchase the refinery and reinstate its operational capacity would be a drop in the bucket. No taxpayer money would be required. The Reserve Bank created money is not borrowed for any other source and would not need to be repaid to the bank. Fuel supply is essential to the economy. The advantages of New Zealand owning the refinery include greater fuel security with the option to refine our own oil in a crisis, reduced costs for New Zealanders with control over pricing leading to lower transport costs and a reduction in prices for goods and services, reduced costs for exporters in getting products to ports and lower air freight charges, an infrastructure base for the development of new fuel options, more competition at the pumps as new retailers would have an easier entry into the market with the refinery acting as a wholesaler, reduced pressure on our overseas exchange as profits would not be transmitted offshore. We therefore call on this committee to recommend to the House of Representatives that it declare the Marsden Point Oil Refinery a nationally strategic asset and require the government to purchase it from the private owners using money created by the country's central bank, so it continues to operate and provide fuel security for New Zealand. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was exactly 10 minutes, which was, and it was a very fulsome submission. So